8 military helicopters land outside a quiet hospital at midnight. Armed soldiers flood the ER, searching for someone they call Angel 6. But no one there knows that the quiet night shift nurse they've worked with for years is the one they came for. What follows is a race against time, enemies closing in, and a past that refuses to stay buried.
Colonel Raymond Holt brought his fist down hard on the administrator's desk. The coffee mug on it shattered on the floor. "I do not care about your protocols," he snarled, his voice low and dangerous. "You will clear all civilians from the emergency room in 4 minutes, or I will do it for you." The administrator, a man who had not been spoken to that way in 30 years, staggered back. Outside, 8 military helicopters were already on the ground. Armed soldiers were moving through the hallways. And somewhere inside that building was the most skilled combat medic the United States had ever trained. She just hoped no one would find out. If your heart is already pounding, please hit that subscribe button. Follow this story to the very end. And leave a comment telling me what city you are watching from. I am curious to see how far this story goes. Now, let us return to the beginning. Flora Montgomery had a very specific routine. She would arrive at St. Jude Medical Center each night at 10:45 minutes before her shift began. She always parked in the same space at the back of the parking lot. She used the side entrance and clocked in, speaking fewer than 6 words to anybody. She preferred it that way. She wanted to be quiet, predictable, and unseen. She was very good at being unseen. Her locker was number 47, in the 3rd row of the nurse's changing room. Inside, she kept 2 extra sets of scrubs, a protein bar she never touched, and a small photo. It was hidden behind a metal panel, safe from view. She was the only person who knew it was there. She had not looked at the picture in almost a year, but she could not bring herself to throw it away. Some things you hold on to, even if it causes you pain. Flora put on her scrubs without looking at her reflection. She avoided mirrors now. She tied her hair back. A few loose strands fell around her face as they always did. Out of habit, she rolled her sleeves all the way down to her wrists. She always made sure her wrists were covered, both of them. "Montgomery," a voice cut through the locker room. She turned. The charge nurse, Deborah Sims, stood in the doorway, a clipboard in her hand. Her expression was already sour. Deborah was 53 years old and as sharp as a doctor's scalpel. She had 0 patience for anything she considered a waste of time, which included most of her staff. "Barnes called in sick again," Deborah said without emotion. "That is the 3rd time this month. You will be on triage duty tonight." Flora simply blinked. "Okay." Deborah just stared at her. "You are not going to argue, or ask for more pay, or complain?" "No." Another long stare. "Fine. You are a very strange woman, Montgomery." She turned around and walked off. Flora almost broke into a smile. Almost. Triage on a Thursday night in Oregon was not usually exciting. It was mostly twisted ankles and chest pains that were just panic attacks. Flora handled it all with a calm, steady presence. Her voice never wavered, and her hands never shook. She had learned to keep her hands steady a long time ago, in a very different place. By midnight, the emergency room was moderately busy. There were 12 patients, with 3 in serious condition. Flora had already helped stabilize a 62-year-old man having a heart attack and had treated a teenager with a bad burn. She had also calmed down a frantic young mother. She helped her see that her toddler had not swallowed a battery, but just a small piece of a rubber eraser. She was updating charts at the nurse's station when Dr. Paul Hennessy walked up. He held a cup of coffee and had a look on his face that was trying too hard to be casual. "A good night so far," he said. Flora continued to type. "Do you want some coffee? I made too much. I am fine." "You always say that." "Because I am always fine." Paul was 44 and had been interested in Flora for about 8 months. He just never had the courage to ask her out. He was a good man, and Flora wished he would find someone else to focus on. "Are you doing anything this weekend?" he asked. "Working. You always work on the weekends. Someone has to." He gave a small laugh. "You know, you are quiet, but you are very good at shutting down a conversation." Flora finally looked up at him. Her gaze was not mean, just direct. "Paul, go and drink your coffee." He nodded, accepting his failure, and walked away. Flora returned to her work. At 12:37, the first tremor shook the hospital. She felt it in her feet before she heard any sound. It was a low, deep vibration. It could have been a large truck driving by outside. But Flora knew that feeling. She had felt it many times before, in places very different from a quiet Oregon hospital. Her hands stopped moving over the keyboard. She looked up. Across the emergency room, a few other nurses looked confused. They glanced at the ceiling and then at each other. A patient in the third bay asked about the noise. Someone joked nervously that it was probably just construction. Flora stood up from her chair. The vibration was getting stronger. It was not a truck, and it was not construction. It was the sound of many large helicopter engines getting closer. She went to the window by the ambulance entrance. She placed her hand on the glass for 3 seconds, feeling the rhythmic shaking. Then she moved back. "Deborah," she said, her voice completely calm. Deborah was already looking right at her from across the room. The look on Flora's face made the charge nurse walk over to her without delay. "What is that?" Deborah asked in a low voice. "You need to move the non-critical patients away from this side of the building," Flora said. "Do it now, and do it quietly." Deborah just stared. "Why?" Flora just looked back at her, and something in that look stopped Deborah from asking again. "Ortega, Patterson, clear out bays 1 through 4, Deborah shouted. Her voice was full of its usual command. She gave no sign that she had no clue why she was giving these orders. The sound was now loud enough for everyone to hear. It was a deep hum that shook the medical bags on their hooks. "Is that a helicopter?" asked a young nurse named Cassie. She was only 26. The first helicopter came into view, its bright searchlight sweeping across the parking lot. Then a second one appeared, and then a third. Someone whispered, "Oh my goodness." By the time the fourth and fifth helicopters appeared, people were out of their beds and crowding the windows. A woman in Bay 7 began to cry. The young mother held her toddler close and backed away. Deborah turned to Flora. "Montgomery, what is going on?" Flora was watching the helicopters land with a strange expression. It was not fear. It was not surprise. It was something deeper and much more complex. "8, she said, almost to herself. "What?" "There are 8 of them." She could hear each individual engine now, their sounds blending together. "That is a full tactical extraction team." Deborah grabbed her arm. "Flora, what do you know about this?" Flora looked down at Deborah's hand, then up into her eyes. For a brief second, the woman who tried so hard to be invisible let her mask slip. Something old showed through. Something that knew exactly what 8 black helicopters meant. "Nothing," Flora said softly. "Keep everyone calm and call security." But security was already on the move, and they were not being effective. The soldiers were already inside. They entered the building quickly and in perfect formation. 8 of them came through the main entrance. 4 more came in through the ambulance bay. They were all in full combat gear. They moved with such skill that the large room suddenly felt very small. They did not raise their weapons or shout at anyone. They were perfectly calm. That calm was more terrifying than shouting would have been. One soldier held up his hand and spoke clearly. "All non-essential staff must move to the end of the hall. No one is in any danger. We need your cooperation." But no one moved a muscle. Then another voice came from behind the soldiers. This voice did not ask, "Clear the room." It was not a shout. It was the kind of voice that never had to be raised. It was a voice that people instantly knew not to argue with. At 12:41 in the morning, Colonel John Vance stepped into the St. Jude Medical Center emergency room. He had the unmistakable look of a man who spent 30 years making choices that no one would ever hear about or comprehend. He was in his late 50s, his face worn by conflicts far harsher than any weather, and his eyes scanned the room with the constant, assessing motion of a camera. He halted in the middle of the chaos. Deborah, as she always did, moved to intercept him. "This is a hospital. You cannot just come in here like this. I do not care who you are. I will need to see some." "Where is Angel 6? Vance demanded. The entire room fell silent. "I am sorry, Deborah said, confused. Angel 6. His eyes were already searching, sweeping over every person in the room, every uniform and set of scrubs, every visible corner and hallway. I need Angel 6 immediately. I do not know what that means, Deborah replied. There is no one here by that. She stopped because she had turned toward the nurse's station and realized Flora was no longer there. The supply hall behind the station was not part of any official tour. It was a narrow, dimly lit passage that ran for about 40 feet alongside the main ER hallway before it forked, one path leading to the pharmacy, the other to a service staircase. Flora had learned its entire layout by her third day on the job. In fact, she had committed the floor plans of the whole hospital to memory within her first 2 weeks. She had not questioned why at the time, she simply did it. It was an old instinct. She moved down the dark corridor without a light, her left hand gently grazing the wall to keep her bearings. Her steps made no noise on the floor. She did not run, because running meant panic, and panic was a luxury she could never afford. She was processing the facts: 8 helicopters, men in full combat gear, and a colonel here in person. And then there was the name, her old name, one she had pushed down so deep she often forgot it for whole shifts at a time. Spoken aloud in her new life, in her emergency room. It had been 3 years. 3 years of being deliberately invisible. 3 years of faded scrubs, quiet words, and a parking space at the very back of the lot. 3 years spent becoming Flora Montgomery, the unremarkable, unseen night shift nurse. She leaned her back against the corridor wall and shut her eyes for precisely 3 seconds. They found her. She could not imagine how. She had been so cautious. She had legally changed her name long before the mission that was meant to be her last. She had moved 3 different times. She had constructed a life so perfectly normal it was like camouflage. And yet, Vance had found her. She opened her eyes. The one thing you could say about John Vance was that he always found who he was looking for. She knew this about him. She had known it for a long time. She knew it even back when she trusted him, back when she was a different person, when trust was something she gave away easily. She began walking again, heading for the service stairs. Behind her, in the ER, she heard the managed pandemonium of soldiers mixing with hospital staff and terrified patients. Over it all, she could hear Vance's voice, asking questions with the calm assurance of someone who already had the answers. She got to the stairwell door and pushed it open. Private First Class Danio stood on the other side. He was a young man, maybe 24, with a stillness that came from intense training, not from experience. He was not aiming his weapon at her. He held it across his chest and looked at her with an expression that was almost an apology. "Ma'am," he said. Flora studied him for a quiet moment. She observed his stance, his placement, the way his eyes tracked her hands, and the subtle tension in his jaw that showed how much he hoped this would be easy. "How many exits did he secure?" she asked. Danny blinked, then answered despite himself. "All of them, ma'am." Flora sighed softly through her nose. Of course he did. She turned and headed back to the emergency room. After just 12 steps, she heard Vance's voice again, much closer now, and she knew he had already deduced where she had gone. She had about 30 seconds left. She used 20 of them standing perfectly still, just breathing, allowing the part of her that was Flora Montgomery to accept what was coming. Then she stepped through the doorway and back into the light. Vance spotted her instantly. His face remained unchanged, but a look of certainty settled in his eyes, like a compass needle finding its north. "There she is," he said. The whole room was watching. Every soldier, every nurse, every patient who could. Dr. Paul Hennessy stood by the medicine cart, his coffee cup still in hand and his mouth slightly agape. Deborah Sims had her arms folded, her gaze darting between Flora and the colonel, her expression showing she was rapidly reevaluating everything she knew. Cassie, a younger nurse, whispered to a coworker, "Who is she?" Vance approached Flora, and she stood her ground, letting him come. He stopped 4 feet away. Up close, he seemed older than she recalled, but his eyes were the same. They were dark, direct, and heavy with the burden of countless choices. "You look different," he stated. "I am different," she replied. "No." He gave a single shake of his head. "You look different." but you are not. She met his gaze. What do you want, Colonel? You already know what I want. Tell me anyway. He observed her for a moment before speaking. Barnes is dying. The name struck her with physical force, but she did not let it show. She remained completely still, her voice steady. What happened? A mission went sideways. His jaw clenched. 18 hours ago. We pulled him out. But he paused. That small hesitation, from a man who never hesitated, told her everything a medical chart could not. The surgeons at the base cannot stabilize him. He is on the helicopter now. We have about 40 minutes. 40 minutes for what? For you to do what you always do. The silence in the room was absolute. No one moved, no one made a sound. All eyes were on Flora. She looked at Vance for a long time. Then she said, so quietly only he could hear, "You had no right to come here." "I know," he said. "Just that. No excuses, no defense. You have no right to use that name." "I know." And Barnes. Her voice broke for a tiny fraction of a second, so small that only someone listening intently would have noticed. "Barnes did not deserve whatever you sent him into." Vance remained silent. Flora gazed down at her hands, resting palms down in front of her, a habit she used when the past became too loud. They were steady. They had always been steady, regardless of the chaos around her or inside her. That was one thing she did not leave behind. She looked back up at him. "Bring him in," she said. Vance gave a single nod and raised his radio. From behind, Deborah appeared at Flora's side, her voice low and tightly controlled. "Flora, what is happening here? Who are you?" Flora reached down and simply pushed up her sleeve. The angel wing tattoo stretched from her wrist to just below her elbow, its lines sharp and dark, the feathers drawn with intricate, meaningful detail. She got it 2 months after the crash, in the first city she fled to. It was both a tribute and a warning. A tribute to the person she was trying to bury, and a warning about why she had to. Deborah stared at the tattoo. "What does that mean?" "It means," Flora said, already walking toward a trauma bay, "that tonight you are going to have to trust me." She did not look back. She was snapping on gloves when the doors flew open and they wheeled Barnes in. She had tried not to imagine what he would look like, but that did not help. The moment the gurney rolled in, she saw Michael Barnes, the man who once carried her from a burning building without a second thought. He was now lying there, covered in tubes and field bandages, with the pale skin of a man losing a silent battle. Something inside her clicked firmly into place, a feeling so sharp she could taste it. The Flora, who parked at the edge of the lot, who spoke few words, who kept her sleeves rolled down, was still there. She had only stepped aside. "Report," she said to the medic with the gurney. Her voice was completely different now. It was different in a way that commanded the attention of every person in the room, even if they did not understand why. "Gunshot wound, blast injury, or a mix?" "Both," the medic answered, his tone immediately matching hers. "Fragmentation in the left chest, single gunshot to the right abdomen. He had a tension pneumothorax. We decompressed it, but it is building again. His blood pressure is falling. His heart rate is..." I can see the heart rate. She was already at his side. Her hands were already moving, doing what they knew how to do. The world around her had shrunk, as it always did in these moments. It contained only what was right in front of her and what had to be done next. "Who is my trauma surgeon?" "That would be me." Dr. Hennessy appeared on the other side of the gurney. His voice was professional and measured, but underneath it was the sound of a man seeing a woman he thought he knew, and finally realizing he had not known her at all. Paul Hennessy. "Paul." She looked up, meeting his eyes over Barnes's body. "You will follow my instructions precisely. You'll move quickly and without question. Can you do that?" She held his stare for 2 whole seconds. "Yes," he replied. With a single nod, she said, "Let's begin." The doors to the trauma room closed behind them. Out in the hall, Colonel Vance stood motionlessly, his gaze fixed on the doors. Deborah came to his side. In her 28 years as a nurse, she had witnessed things that would stay with her for life. She had seen humanity at its lowest and its highest, and every messy part in the middle. Her eyes went to the trauma room doors. She will save him, won't she? Deborah asked. Her words were more of a statement than a question. Vance was silent for a beat. Then he answered, She never fails. Inside, Flora Montgomery placed her hands on the chest of the man who was once her sergeant. She felt the unnatural rhythm of his breathing and called out, I need an 18-gauge needle, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Now. Her hands were steady. They always were. The trauma room was small, but it felt tiny at this moment. Flora moved in silence, a quiet so powerful it had its own weight. It drew everyone in, forcing them to match her movements and even her breathing. Paul Hennessy had been a trauma surgeon for 11 years. In his career, he had known intimidating attendings, impressive residents, and nurses who kept him grounded. But never had he shared a patient with a person like her. She never repeated a request. She made decisions without pausing. Her movements flowed from one task to the next, like a river finding its path. It was not about being told where to go. The river just knew the course. Chest tube, she commanded. Ortega, the nurse next to her, had it ready before the words were fully spoken. Blood pressure? Flora asked, her eyes still on the patient. 74/40, Paul reported. It will dip again before it rises. Nobody should worry when it does. She spoke while her hands moved with a rhythm all their own, ignoring the beeping machines and the tension. She ignored the ghost from her past, Colonel John Vance, standing just 20 feet away. Michael, she whispered, not for anyone else to hear but Barnes. You have to hang on for me. Do you hear me? Stay with me. But Barnes gave no reply. His breathing was shallow and difficult, his body fighting just to perform that simple, vital task. He does not hear you, Ortega said gently. Oh, he can, Flora stated with absolute certainty. They always can. Paul observed her skillful hands and remained silent. It was 12:51 in the morning. A strange quiet had fallen over the emergency room. The soldiers had moved away from the center, covering the exits without any orders. They knew the real fight was happening behind those doors, and they were powerless to help. At the nurse's station, Deborah Sims stood with folded arms. Her jaw was clenched with the effort of stopping herself from doing what she desperately wanted. She wanted to march into that room and demand answers from the woman she had known for nearly 3 years, yet clearly did not know at all. Cassie came up next to her. What is going on in there? She asked. Medicine, was Deborah's short reply. But she is just a nurse. Deborah shot her a look. Be quiet, Cassie. A young soldier with a sergeant's patch and short hair approached Deborah. Ma'am, Sergeant Reyes, can I help manage the floor while your people are busy? Deborah stared at her for a few seconds. Normally, she would have had strong words for a soldier offering to run her unit. But tonight, she just said, yes, bed 6 needs a pressure check. The patient in Bay 8 is trying to get up again. And I need to locate the portable ultrasound I ordered 3 hours ago. Reyes gave a single nod and left immediately. As Deborah watched her, she reflected that the world was far more complex than her training ever suggested. Near the window, Dr. Paul Hennessy's resident, Marcus Webb, a 29-year-old who had shadowed Paul for 6 months, was frozen in place, staring at the trauma room. He had been motionless for about 4 minutes. Deborah knew the expression on his face well. It was the look of a person whose entire world had been turned upside down, leaving only a huge question. She understood that feeling. At 1:03 in the morning, Barnes's heart monitor suddenly went wild. Paul Hennessy shouted it, but Flora was already in motion. V-fib, she announced. Paddles. Ortega began to protest. We are not allowed to. Paddles, Flora repeated in the same commanding voice. Ortega immediately stopped and grabbed them. Paul found his hands on the crash cart without thinking, charging to 200. 150. Flora corrected him. His chest is damaged. 150. And mind the placement. He glanced at her over the cart. Her gaze was already on him, unwavering and confident. She was waiting for his trust. He charged to 150. Clear. The electricity jolted Barnes's body. The monitor faltered, then slowly found a beat again. It was weak, but it was there. Paul let out a breath of relief. Flora did not. Keep your eyes on him, she said. His pressure is dropping fast. We must pack the wound in his abdomen before he codes again. Paul spoke cautiously. Flora, what you did just now, the charge level, the paddle placement, that is not by the book. No, she confirmed. It is a field protocol, adjusted for his unique wounds. She put on new gloves, and it is effective. How can you possibly know his injuries so well that, because I have treated him in the past, she cut in. Those words hung in the space between them, thick with a complex history that Paul was just starting to grasp. Paul, I promise to explain what I can, but only after Michael Barnes is out of danger. For now, I just need a surgeon. Can you do that for me? Yes, he answered with total sincerity. It was 1:14 in the morning. Most people were wrong about Colonel Vance. They saw his rigid jaw, heard his commanding voice, and felt his authority enter a room ahead of him. They all assumed he was an impatient man. They thought he was the type to demand and force his way through things because he hated to wait. They were mistaken. Vance had more patience than anyone. He could endure silence and darkness in situations that would shatter other people for as long as it took. He had perfected this skill over his career, knowing that impatient people are the ones who fail. But here, in this hospital hallway, hearing the faint noises from the trauma room, his patience was wearing thin. It had been 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days since he last saw Flora Montgomery. He had not tried to remember the number, it just stuck in his mind. It was like casualty figures, operation dates, or the coordinates of a disastrous mission. He had been waiting for 31 minutes. Sergeant Reyes came to his side. Sir, the hospital administrator, Garrett, is causing problems. He has been on the phone for 20 minutes, and it does not sound like a personal call. What sort of problems? Vance asked. The legal sort, she replied. Vance's face remained a mask. Inform Mr. Garrett that this hospital is under Federal Emergency Code 7 Bravo. If he wishes to talk about it, I will be available after Sergeant Barnes is stable. Reyes paused. Sir, is Code 7 Bravo real? It is now, Vance replied. She nodded and left. Vance turned his attention back to the trauma room doors. He was the one who approved the mission that landed Barnes in this hospital. He reviewed the intel, calculated the risks, and gave the final order. Over 30 years, he had made countless decisions just like it. Most turned out well, a few did not. That was just part of the job, a truth he had accepted many years ago. He tried to convince himself of that now, but standing in this hallway, it was difficult to believe. The time was 1:22 in the morning. She recognized your name, Deborah said. Vance turned to face her. The head nurse had appeared next to him as silently as a shadow. She moved with a skill honed over decades, making her stealthier than many of his own troops. I beg your pardon? He asked. Flora. When you arrived, she did not seem shocked that you knew who she was, but her reaction when you mentioned Barnes's name, that was something else. Deborah studied him with eyes that could see right through people. What kind of situation did you put him in? That information is classified. He is dying in my hospital, which is precisely why we are here. Deborah paused for a second. How long were you searching for her? Vance thought about ignoring the question for about 2 seconds. For some time, he admitted. She did not wish to be found. No, Deborah agreed. But you located her regardless. Her tone was not blaming. She was just putting pieces together. And you came tonight for her, and only her, not just any medic or surgeon. Vance remained silent. She is the finest you have ever witnessed, Deborah stated. It was a declaration, not an inquiry. After a considerable pause, Vance answered softly, yes. Deborah gazed at the doors of the trauma bay. She has been with us for almost 3 years, she continued. She treats every shift as if she has to prove her worth. Never sick, never complains, and never requests anything. She took a breath. I used to think she was just very disciplined. She is, Vance confirmed. No, Deborah countered, shaking her head. Discipline appears differently. What she is a person who has carried a heavy weight for a very long time, working so hard she never has to set it down and examine it. She shot him a knowing look. Are you aware of the burden she carries? Vance's jaw clenched ever so slightly. Yes, he said. I am. At 1:31 in the morning. At 1 in the morning, inside the trauma bay, Flora was on her third pair of gloves, and the blood pressure of Michael Barnes had gone up by 4 points. It was not a lot, but it was progress. She knew his body nearly as well as her own. She had worked on Barnes twice before, in situations that made this trauma bay seem like a luxury hotel. She was aware of his blood type, his medication allergies, how his system reacted to shock, and the scar on his left arm from the Kandahar mission they never officially discussed. She knew he was a stubborn man, more stubborn than any patient she had ever encountered, sometimes more stubborn than the laws of physics. Come on, Michael, she whispered. I know you are listening to me. You are the most infuriatingly persistent man I have ever known in my life. This is not the way you leave. This is definitely not the way you leave. Paul overheard her. He glanced up from his task. You are talking to him again. I am always talking to him. Do you suppose his pressure is actually increasing? Ortega asked. Paul checked the monitor. 79/48. It was still low, but it was on the rise. He looked at Flora. I told you, she said. At 1:39 in the morning. The surprise came from a source no one in the hospital anticipated. The emergency room doors opened, and a man in regular clothing entered. He was in his mid-50s, heavyset with the flushed face of someone who had recently lost a loud argument. He was accompanied by two men in suits, both with federal badges clearly visible on their belts. The man was Gerald Harmon, the deputy director of a government oversight agency with a purposely vague area of authority. He had been on an airplane for 3 hours. He had not had any sleep. He was in a foul temper and was accustomed to taking his anger out on the nearest person. The person directly in front of him was Colonel John Vance. The two men made eye contact. John, Harmon said. Gerald, Vance replied. The emergency room became incredibly silent, the way a room does when people know they are witnessing a confrontation with a deep history. You had no authorization to retrieve Barnes in this manner, Harmon stated. His voice was steady, but just barely. You were not permitted to find or make contact with the asset. Barnes was perishing. Barnes is a casualty of an approved mission and was supposed to be dealt with through official channels. He was perishing in a field in a country I cannot mention in this building, Vance said, his voice extremely low and cold. And you want to lecture me about authorization? She was not to be approached, Harmon insisted. That was our deal. Her removal from the program was final. Her new identity was protected. You had no authority. She is the only living person who can save him. There are procedures for this. The procedures were not working for him. Vance said, I made a judgment call. You made a judgment call. Harmon's voice lowered. John, do you have any idea of the consequences? She is exposed now. This hospital, these staff members, they have all seen her. They are aware of the call sign. It will get out. The information always gets out. Then we will handle it, Vance replied, after she saves Barnes. And what about her wishes? Deborah's voice cut through their argument. Both of the men turned. Deborah Sims stood 5 feet away, her arms still folded, with no remaining patience in her whatsoever. You, she said, looking at Harmon, I do not know who you are, but you are in my hospital discussing my nurse as if she is a document in a filing cabinet, and I must ask you to stop. She then turned to Vance. And you appeared here because you required her help, not because you considered the price she would pay. You are aware that is correct. She glared at both of them. That woman has lived a quiet and cautious life for 3 years. She created something here, something genuine. And tonight, you two arrived and destroyed it, and now you stand here debating about authorization. She shook her head in disapproval. Shame on both of you. Harmon just stared at her. Ma'am, this is a matter of national. I do not care, Deborah said flatly. A silence fell over them. Then, one of Harmon's men in a suit leaned in and whispered something in his ear. Harmon's expression changed in a way that was difficult to decipher. What is it? Vance asked. Harmon looked directly at him. His expression was different. The bureaucratic rage was present, but underneath it was something else that, if you looked close enough, resembled fear. There has been a second attack, Harmon said. Vance stood perfectly still. What kind? The same organization that attacked Barnes's unit. They have found the extraction point. He paused for a moment. They are aware she is here. At 1:47 in the morning, Vance had his radio in his hand before Harmon could finish his sentence. Reyes, establish a full perimeter immediately. All exits are on active watch. No one enters these doors without my direct approval. He looked at Harmon. How much time? Our intelligence suggests they are 30 minutes away, perhaps less. Who is on their way? Deborah asked. Her voice remained unchanged. It was steady, still in command. But her eyes made a brief, uncontrollable movement toward the trauma bay doors. The people who do not want Barnes to testify about what he witnessed, Harmon answered. And then, because Deborah was looking at him with an intensity that required a better explanation, he added more. They are also people who do not want Angel 6 to be active again. Deborah turned her gaze to Vance. She does not know. No. She is in there trying to save his life, and she is unaware that the individuals who hurt him are coming for her. Vance's jaw was set like a stone. She will be told once Barnes is stable. And if she must know sooner than that, he gave no response because he knew the answer. Flora needed every single second of the next few minutes to keep Barnes alive. If he went in there and informed her of the threat, the atmosphere in the room would shift. A small part of her concentration would be diverted, and that tiny part could be the difference between life and death. He had made that calculation. He had made it in the 30 seconds after Harmon told him. He knew it was a cold calculation. He also knew it was the kind of calculation that Flora would never forgive. He was accustomed to being unforgiven. She will be told when Barnes is stable, he repeated. Deborah stared at him for a very long moment. Then she walked to her nurse's station and grabbed the phone. This is Charge Nurse Sims. I require a lockdown procedure for the east and south wings. I also need security at every outside door on the first floor, and it must be done within the next 2 minutes. She paused, listening to the reply. Because I ordered it, Kevin, go. She hung up the phone and looked at Vance. I am not like you. I will not calculate what she has a right to know, but I will give you 5 more minutes before I go in there myself. Vance replied, Thank you. Do not thank me, Deborah said. That was not for you. At 1:55 in the morning. Flora sensed the change in Barnes before the equipment did. It was a subtle shift in his stillness, a very slight change in the way his body resisted the pressure she applied with her hands. She had learned to detect it years before in places where machines were either broken or non-existent, where only your hands and your intuition were available to you. He is starting to turn around, she announced. Paul looked up from the stitches he was working on. The pressure is still. He is turning around, she said again. Her voice was quiet but confident. Ortega said, 86/52. Paul blinked. He stared at the monitor for a long time. Yes, that is actually happening. Keep going, Flora instructed. We are not finished, but he is resisting, and she allowed herself to feel it just for a moment. It was a small, private feeling. The unique relief that came from knowing that the same stubbornness she had always complained about in Michael Barnes was the only thing keeping him alive tonight. That somewhere beneath the injuries, the blood loss, and the machines, that unyielding, frustrating, and incredible will to simply live on still existed. You were always the most difficult patient, she said to him softly, and at this moment I have never been more thankful for that in my entire life. Paul looked at her from above his surgical mask. His eyes held an expression she did not have time to understand right now. Flora, we are not finished, she replied. I know, he interrupted. Never mind. Let us finish the job. She nodded in agreement, and they continued. At 2:04 in the morning, Barnes's pressure was steady at 91/60 when Vance's radio crackled. Colonel, it was Reyes's voice, tense and controlled. We have activity on the southern perimeter. Vehicle lights, no visible license plates, about 400 meters away and not heading toward the main highway. Vance looked over at Harmon. Harmon remained silent. How many are there? Vance spoke into the radio. At least 2 vehicles. There could be more hidden by the trees. Trying to get a better look. Maintain your position. Do not engage. I am repeating, do not engage without my direct order. He put the radio down. Deborah was right next to him. She was no longer pretending not to listen. Your 5 minutes have passed, she told him. He looked at the trauma bay doors. I am aware, he said, and he began walking toward them. At 2:07 in the morning, Flora heard the door open but did not turn. We are in the middle of something, she said. Unless the hospital is burning down, please leave. It is not on fire, Vance said. But there was a bigger problem. She still would not turn around. This was worse than the man with 3 devastating wounds and blood pressure that had been failing all night. He said her name, Flora, just her name. Not Angel 6. Not a code name. It was the name she had picked for herself. The name she built her new life around. That made her stop. It made her hands pause for only a second. She glanced at Ortega, a look that said everything necessary, and then she turned. Vance stood in the doorway. He seemed older in this light, or maybe she just saw him in a new way. His face wore a look she had seen only a few times over many years. It was not regret. John Vance was not a man who dealt in regret, but this was close. It was the look of someone about to ask for something he had no right to ask, and he knew it. They know you are here, he said. The room became completely still. Ortega kept her hands on Barnes, not moving. Paul stared at the monitor, not looking up, but everyone heard him. Flora stared at Vance for a long time. How long? She asked. 20 minutes? Maybe less. She looked down at Barnes, at the numbers climbing steadily on the monitor. She looked at her own hands, still gloved and stained from the past hour and a half. She faced Vance again, and a decision settled on her face, replacing the conflict and pain she felt since he arrived. Everything became simple, not because the problem was simple, but because her choice was. Okay, she said. Vance blinked. It was a tiny reaction, almost unseen, but she noticed it. Okay, Wayne, I heard you, she said. I said, okay. She turned back to the patient. But right now, I am finishing this. The reason you came here, the reason you broke our every promise, is on this table, and he is not stable yet. She took over from Ortega again, never missing a beat. 20 minutes is more than enough time, so get out of my trauma bay and let me work. Vance remained in the doorway for another moment. Then he said very softly, yes, ma'am. He stepped away. The door swung shut. Paul Hennessy looked at Flora from across the patient. She did not look back at him. She was focused on her work, but her jaw was set like stone. And if you watched the line of her shoulders, the way she held herself with immense control, you could see it. This was the woman who had been invisible for 3 years. The woman who built a quiet, real life from the ruins of her past, now saving a life in the one room she truly owned. Because no matter what else was true, no matter what was coming for her beyond that door, this was the one skill she never forgot. Her hands were steady, they were always steady. Barnes's blood pressure held at 93/61 for 4 straight minutes. And Flora let herself trust it, not celebrate, not breathe a sigh of relief like other people. She just believed in it, the quiet way you believe a bridge will hold you before you take the first step. You never know for sure until you do it, but you have to step. He needs a vascular surgeon and a proper operating room, she said, without looking up. What does this hospital have? We have Dr. Renata Vasquez on call, Paul said. She is good, very good. Call her in. It is 2 in the morning. Call her in, Paul. He picked up his phone. Flora looked at Barnes's face. The gray color of his skin had faded slightly. It was not gone, but it had changed enough to mean his body was finally fighting back. He was in his mid-30s, but tonight, he looked much older. He had always looked older than his age. She used to tease him about it, back when teasing people was a thing she did. Hey, Ortega said quietly next to her. Are you okay? Flora looked at her. Ortega was 31, skilled with her hands and even better with her instincts. Flora had always enjoyed working with her. Yes, Flora replied. Ortega studied her for a moment, with the gentle understanding that an answer is not always the truth. Then she returned to monitoring the patient's lines. Flora pulled off her top layer of gloves and reached for a clean pair. She had 11 minutes, possibly less. She planned to use every single one of them. At 2:13 in the morning, the feeling in the emergency room had changed. The soldiers who had been scattered around were no longer standing still. They now moved with a tense purpose, checking their positions, whispering to each other, and watching their colonel with a focus that the staff understood was serious. Something bad was coming. Cassie, who was young and wore her emotions on her face, approached Sergeant Reyes by the window. "Are we in danger?" she asked. Reyes looked at her. "Not if you stay away from the windows and do exactly what I say, if I say anything. That is not a no." "No," Reyes agreed. "It is not." Cassie turned very pale and asked no more questions. Marcus Webb, Paul's resident, had moved to the other side of the nurse's station. He was pretending to write charts, but he was just staring at a blank screen. His mind was caught between the miracle surgery he just saw and the danger parked in the darkness outside. Gerald Harmon was on his phone and had been for 6 minutes. His voice was a controlled whisper that gave away nothing, but his red face told a very different story. Deborah had given up trying to manage the room and had started taking action. She moved all mobile patients away from the outer walls. She turned off unnecessary lights in the east hallway. She sent 3 of her nurses upstairs to be with the inpatients, telling them not to come down. She did all this with a calm voice that left no room for argument. She did it because she was 61 years old and had been a nurse during 3 hurricanes, a mass casualty incident, and a gas leak that cleared an entire hospital wing. She did not panic. Panic was a luxury for people with nothing to do. She always had something to do. She walked over to Vance, who was watching the south-facing window. "What kind of people should we expect?" she asked. He did not look at her. The kind who are very good at their jobs. "Are your people better?" A long pause. "On a good night, yes." "Is this a good night?" Another, longer pause. "It is a complicated night." Deborah said, "You need to be honest with me right now, or my patients are going to get hurt." Vance turned to look at her. "I am going to do everything in my power to make sure that does not happen." "That is not a guarantee." "No," he said. "It is not." Deborah met his eyes for 3 solid seconds. Then she gave a single, sharp nod, accepting the harsh reality, and went back to her work. At 2:19 in the morning, the radio on Vance's vest came to life. "Colonel, 2 vehicles confirmed. SUVs, blacked out. They are stationary 250 meters south. No movement yet, but we have spotted at least 4 individuals inside, maybe more." "Copy. Hold your positions. If they move toward the building, you tell me first." "Do not engage." "Sir," a pause. "Sir," Richter says, "one of them is using optics on the building." Vance's jaw tightened. "Copy that." He put down the radio and looked at Harmon. The man had finished his call and was standing close by. His red-faced anger had shifted to a quiet, guarded look. "Gerald," Vance said, his voice low enough for only Harmon to hear. "Is there something you should tell me about how they found us this fast?" Harmon kept his eyes on the south window. "John, that is a very serious accusation. That is not an answer." "No," Harmon said. "It is not." He finally faced him. "I found out about this location through proper intelligence channels 40 minutes ago. I told you that. How proper?" A silence. "Gerald, there might have been a security breach," Harmon said very quietly. "At the agency level, we are not sure how big." Vance stared at him. "You knew there was a possible breach and you came here anyway?" "I came here to assess the situation. You led them straight to us." Vance's voice did not get louder. It got worse. It became flat, cold, and dangerously precise. "You knew about a leak, and you got on a plane with a federal ID showing on your hip, and you came straight to a compromised asset." Harmon started to say, "I did not know the breach extended to." "How long have you known about the leak?" Silence. "Gerald, how long?" 6 days, Harmon admitted. The confession hung between them like a physical weight. 6 days. The very same 6 days that Barnes's mission was compromised. The 6 days in which Barnes was shot and brought across the world to a hospital that should have been completely off the grid. Vance understood everything. Up his radio. His voice was completely controlled. "Raise, We must assume this location is compromised. Prepare the patient for extraction. I need a route. Sir, the patient is not stable enough for transport. I know. Find me a route anyway. He lowered the radio and stared at Harmon. If that woman is harmed because of a leak you ignored for 6 days, you do not want to be in the same room with me for the next 10 years. Do you understand? Harmon remained silent. Vance turned his back on him and walked toward the trauma bay. It was 2:24 in the morning. Flora sensed him approaching this time. It was not the sound of his footsteps, but the change in the air just before the door opened. It always shifted when Vance was about to enter a room. She had spent 2 years learning that feeling and had never forgotten it. She did not turn around. Barnes is more stable than he was 20 minutes ago, she said. He requires surgery. I have given him enough time for a vascular surgeon to arrive and do the job correctly. He is not going anywhere tonight, Flora. And before you say what you came to say, you must understand that moving him now would reverse everything I have done in the past hour and a half. And I will not allow that to happen. Not for your schedule, not for your threat assessment, and not for any reason short of a direct, immediate danger to everyone in this building. Vance said, the leak is at the agency level. Harmon knew about it for 6 days. Flora froze. Ortega looked up. Paul looked up. The monitors continued their steady beeping, unaware of the heavy words just spoken. 6 days, Flora repeated. Yes. She carefully set down the instrument in her hand and turned to face him. She looked at Vance in the way she had learned to assess threats, quickly, accurately, and without emotion. The calculation was running behind her eyes. 6 days ago, Barnes's mission had been compromised. Barnes was shot. Barnes was brought here. And somewhere during those 6 days, among the people who knew about the extraction, her identity, and this hospital, there was a traitor. Who knew I was here? She asked. A short list? Vance replied. Myself, 2 of my command staff, and Harmon. Harmon, she said again. Yes. And he came to this location in person. Yes. With his federal identification visible, Vance's face confirmed it before he could speak. Flora glanced at the ceiling for a single second. Then she looked back at him. You need to move every non-essential person in this building to the upper floors immediately, not in 10 minutes. Now, Reyes is already working on it, Colonel. She was pulling off her gloves, and I need to know precisely what equipment you have outside and what you are working with. Because if those people know I am here, they will not just wait in their cars. And when they make their move, I need to know what this building looks like from their position. Vance watched her for a moment. His expression was a mix of complex, old feelings that were hard to name. Then he said, 2 6-person tactical teams. Standard equipment. 1 sniper on the east roof. A sniper on the east roof is useless if they approach from the west access road. I know. I placed O'Kane at the west maintenance entrance. O'Kane is good, she said. The casual way she spoke, the fact that she already knew the name of the young soldier in the stairwell, told Paul and Ortega more about Flora Montgomery than their 3 years of working together ever had. What about the parking garage? I have 2 people on the 2nd level. Move one of them to the service corridor entrance on the ground floor. It is the most direct inside route from the garage to this part of the hospital. Vance was silent for a moment. You have studied the building's layout. I always study the layout, she said plainly. She looked at Barnes, her hand briefly touching the railing of his gurney. It was a quick touch, not professional, something more. She then looked at Paul. He needs constant monitoring. Page me with any change in his pressure. It does not matter where I am. Vasquez is on her way. I called her, Paul said, his voice careful and steady. Underneath that calm was a man trying to understand a massive amount of new information about a person he had misjudged for months. She will be here in 15 minutes. Good. When she arrives, she goes directly to operating room preparation. You will update her on everything. Flora started toward the door. Flora? Paul's voice stopped her. She turned. He looked at her with a directness that sometimes caught her by surprise, reminding her that he was more than just an easy smile and a coffee cup. What are you planning to do? She met his gaze for a moment. Whatever is necessary. She pushed through the door. It was 2:31 in the morning. The emergency room felt different from how she had left it an hour before. The general fear had shifted from the sharp shock of helicopters and soldiers to a low, steady hum of dread. It was the unique anxiety of people who knew something bad was coming but could do nothing to stop it. Deborah was at the nurse's station. She looked at Flora without speaking right away, which was not like her. It told Flora that Deborah already knew most of what Vance had said. Upper floors, Flora stated. I handled it 15 minutes ago. Deborah met her eyes. I told them it was a fire drill. Flora almost smiled. Smart. How is Barnes? He is alive, holding on. She scanned the room. Reyes and 2 other soldiers were moving with purpose near the ambulance entrance. Harmon stood by the far wall, phone in hand, looking like a man with no good choices left. Cassie and 2 younger nurses stood together near the medication area, trying hard to appear calmer than they felt. Flora walked over to them. Cassie looked up with the expression of someone who desperately wanted to ask questions but had been told not to. Listen to me, Flora said. Her voice was her emergency room voice, the one that cut through chaos and made people focus instantly. You 3 will take the medication cart and all critical items from the cold storage cabinet. You will move it all to the 2nd floor supply room. You will lock the door from the inside and you will not open it until either Deborah or I come for you personally. Not a soldier, not another doctor, only Deborah or me. Cassie asked, what about the patients still down here? Bay 1 and 2 are clear. The patient in Bay 3 can be moved. I will take care of Bay 5 myself. She looked at each of them in turn. Do you understand me? 3 heads nodded. Go. They left. She turned and saw Marcus Webb still at the nurse's station. He was 29 years old and likely never imagined his 2nd year of residency would be like this. Webb, she said. He jumped. Yes. Hello. Yes. You have trauma experience. I have, yes. A basic trauma rotation I completed 6 months ago. That is good enough. You will stay with Dr. Hennessy and Barnes until Vasquez gets here. You will not leave that room. You will not open that door for anyone until Paul or I give the word. Can you handle that? Marcus glanced at the trauma bay doors and then back at Flora. He swallowed hard. Yes, go. He left. Flora turned to Deborah. You should go upstairs too. Deborah looked at her as if she had said something deeply insulting. I absolutely will not. Deborah, I have been a nurse in this hospital for 9 years. Flora Montgomery. And if you believe I am going to hide in a supply room while my emergency room is... Okay, Flora interrupted. Okay, then stay near the station and keep your head down if anything begins. Begins? Deborah repeated slowly. What exactly might begin? Flora met her gaze. I honestly do not know. That is the truth. Deborah took this in with the calm of someone who had accepted long ago that medicine offered few certainties, and life offered even fewer. All right, she said. What do you require from me? Flora opened her mouth to reply, but at that moment, Vance's radio crackled loudly across the room. Colonel, they are on the move. It was 2:38 in the morning. The first vehicle sped through the south parking entrance. Reyes saw it before the perimeter guards called it in because she had been watching the south window the entire time. The instant the headlights swept into the lot, she was already reacting. South vehicle, moving fast, she announced. Her voice was perfectly steady, not afraid, not rushed like someone taken by surprise. It was the urgent tone of someone carrying out a well-rehearsed plan. Colonel, the south vehicle is breaking through the barrier. O'Kane, do you see anything on the west side? The west is clear, O'Kane's voice came back. Nothing on the maintenance road? Baker, Chang, south exit, now. Vance was already at the corridor entrance. He looked at Flora, who had moved to stand 3 feet to his left. He had not even heard her approach. He had always both hated and admired her ability to do that. They are trying to divide our attention, Flora said quietly. One vehicle is visible, another is waiting. They want us to watch the south while something else is happening. O'Kane said the west is clear. The west is what they want you to ignore, she said, looking at him. The west maintenance road leads to the service entrance. It is not on any public maps of this hospital. You would have to already know the layout. They have scouted this place. They have had 6 days, she stated. Vance stared at her for a brief second, then spoke into his radio. Oh, I need eyes inside the service corridor. Right now. Forget the road. Get inside. There was a pause. Sir, the corridor's locked, he said. A muffled thud echoed from deep within the hospital structure. It was not a gunshot. It was something mechanical, the unmistakable noise of a door forced open from the wrong side. From the nurse's station, Deborah spoke in a hushed tone. That is the loading dock, but Flora was already in motion. Vance called out sharply, Flora, wait! The warning came too late. She vanished through a side door just as his radio crackled to life again. Reyes reported the south vehicle had stopped. 2 people were out, moving on foot toward the ambulance bay. They were coming from 2 directions at once. Caught between them, in a dim service corridor on the ground floor of a hospital in Oregon, Montgomery advanced toward a sound no one could explain. Yet, everyone knew it meant trouble. It was 2:41 in the morning. The corridor was dark, as hospital service halls are in the dead of night. It was not pitch black, but it was dark enough. The 2 men inside had not bothered with flashlights, letting the glow from exit signs guide their way. That light was enough for them. It was also enough for Flora. She was unarmed, she had no access to any weapons, a fact she had confirmed in the first 30 seconds after Vance's warning. Everything she did next was based on that reality. But she had the building. She knew this place intimately. They did not. She flattened herself against the wall where the service hall formed a T with the main supply route. She listened. 2 pairs of feet, walking slowly. They thought they were still hidden. They were heading for the pharmacy corridor, which led straight to the emergency room. She did not have to think about what to do. There was no choice to be made. There was only the immediate task, and then the one after that. She slid around the corner, moving away from them, toward the loading dock. She slammed her palm against the emergency floodlight panel as she ran past. The hallway instantly blazed with light. She heard the men halt, their sharp, muffled gasps of surprise giving them away. She heard them regrouping. She was already at the intercom by the loading dock. She pressed the button for all floors. Her voice was perfectly calm, the one she used to command a room's attention. Security alert. Service level corridor. 2 unauthorized persons. All personnel. Something slammed into the wall beside her head. She ducked behind the panel and scrambled left, keeping her body low. She used a tall supply shelf for cover. Her heart hammered in her chest, but her mind was in a different place entirely. It was a cold, clear, and focused place, where she had spent most of her adult life before choosing to live differently. She had forgotten the deep quiet of that place. She heard the scrape of boots on the floor. One of them was advancing quickly. The other hung back, providing cover. It was a standard 2-person team. She recognized the formation. She had trained for this very scenario. The shelving unit shook as a hand grabbed its edge. She moved before he could pull it. She came around the other side, fast and low. The man nearest her only had a moment to realize she was not where he expected. Then she had his arm, using his own forward motion to throw him off balance. He crashed to the floor. His partner yelled out. She was already through the door at the end of the hall. It was 2:44 in the morning. She burst through the stairwell entrance to the emergency room, and everyone looked up. Vance was at the ambulance doors with Reyes and 2 others, dealing with the pair from the south. His eyes met Flora's. In that silent look, more was communicated than in most conversations. Service corridor, she reported. There were 2. One is down. The other is running or calling for backup. Reyes was already speaking into her radio. Harmon rushed over from across the room, his face pale as a sheet. We have to start the extraction now. We can move Barnes on a... You do not get to make that decision, Flora cut in. She did not look at him. She was staring down the corridor she had just left. Barnes is not going anywhere. This location is compromised. This hospital was compromised 6 days ago, she stated. This time she did look at him. Whatever Harmon saw in her eyes made him fall silent. It was a breach you were aware of, so you have no say in what happens now. A noise came from the ambulance bay. It was Reyes's voice, snapping a command into her radio. Then came the short, sharp sound of a fight just outside the doors. The entire emergency room fell silent. The doors swung open and Owe walked in backward. He was holding the arm of a man in street clothes who was fighting him every step of the way. "I got the second guy from the hallway," Owe said, catching his breath. "Baker has the other one outside." The man in his grip scanned the room. His eyes were wide, desperately searching for any escape. He looked past the soldiers, the staff, and Vance. Then his eyes found Flora, and they stopped. Flora stared right back at him. She spoke to Vance, her voice barely a whisper. "I know him." Vance turned. "From where?" She held Vance's gaze for a long, meaningful moment. From before, it was 2:51 in the morning. His name was Dolan. She remembered him as a logistics guy on a joint task force. She had shaken his hand at a meeting 18 months before the crash that was supposed to have taken her life. He had a bland face and a professional attitude. There was nothing about him back then to suggest he was anything other than what he appeared to be. She had been wrong. She saw that clearly now. She saw it in the way you do when a new fact makes you re-examine all your old memories. And suddenly, too many things make sense. "How long?" she asked him. He remained silent. "How long were you betraying the team?" She stepped closer to him. Owe's grip on Dolan's arm tightened, but Flora's tone was not threatening. It was steady, direct, and contained, which was far more chilling. "Was Kandahar your doing?" For a brief second, a flicker of something crossed Dolan's face. Vance asked, "What happened in Kandahar?" Flora never took her eyes off Dolan. 3 of our team were in what was supposed to be a safe location. Someone gave up their position. She paused. One of our people did not come back. The emergency room was completely still. Behind the nurse's desk, Deborah stood with her hands pressed flat against the counter, not moving at all. Dolan finally spoke. "You were dead." The crash was confirmed. "You could not confirm anything," Flora replied. "Because there was nothing left. Because I made sure there would be nothing left to find." At last, she looked at Vance. The crash was not an accident. Vance just stared at her. "I caused it," she confessed. "I knew we had a leak. I just did not know who it was. I had to vanish before they could finish me off." She turned back to Dolan. "I did not know it was you, but I do now." Dolan's jaw clenched. "You have no proof." "I do not need any," Flora said. "You came here to a hospital in the middle of the night with a tactical team. The security cameras alone will lead to a very interesting discussion." She nodded at Owe. "Get him out of my sight." Owe began to move. Dolan struggled, but he was taken away. Vance was looking at Flora with an expression she had never seen on his face. It was not a look he showed often, she guessed. "You faked your own death," he said. It was not an accusation, just a statement of fact he was trying to understand. "Yes," she answered, "because you believe the team was compromised." "Because the team was compromised," she corrected him. "I just did not have the evidence yet." "And you did not tell me." She looked at him without flinching. "I did not know if it was you." A heavy silence filled the space between them. A silence that carried years of shared history. It was the unique quiet between two people who had once trusted each other with their lives and had just found the limit of that trust. Vance finally spoke. "It was not me." "I know that now," she said. There was another pause. "I am sorry," he said. She could hear the genuine regret in his voice, which made it both easier and harder to accept. "I know that, too," she replied. Deborah's voice cut through the tension with perfect timing, as it always did when a room needed a change. "Vasquez is here," she announced. She appeared from a hallway with a small, sharp-featured woman in her 50s. The newcomer was pulling on gloves, her calm eyes professionally assessing the chaotic scene. She had clearly been woken up, but she did not seem to mind. "She needs to see Barnes immediately." Flora turned. The emergency room was in disarray, full of people who would be thinking about this night for years to come. But it was still her responsibility, her space. She started walking toward the trauma bay. "Flora?" Vance called out. She paused, but did not turn around. "We have to talk," he said. about what happens from here. I know, she answered. She stood for a moment in the center of the room. The overhead lights bathed everything in a harsh, honest glow. It was the kind of lighting hospitals use because there is no room for softness. She felt the full weight of the night and of the last 3 years she had spent trying to be invisible settle on her shoulders. She felt the weight of the last 90 minutes she spent pulling Barnes back from death, the name she had hidden, the identity she had created, and the space between them that never quite closed. She felt the pressure of it all. Then she stood tall, covered her angel wing tattoo, and kept moving. A patient needed to be transferred, a surgeon needed a report, and the entire floor needed to be put back in order. Everything else would have to wait. The surgery had been underway for 1 hour and 43 minutes when Dr. Ranatada Vasquez entered. She pulled down her mask with the unsoftened efficiency of someone who no longer sweetened difficult news. Flora was waiting in the hallway outside. She had not taken a seat. She stood with her back to the wall, her arms hanging loose, her eyes fixed on the operating room doors. She had been standing like that since sending Barnes through those doors, and a piece of her had been frozen there ever since. Vasquez met her gaze. "He is out of surgery," she announced. Flora did not reply. Her eyes locked onto Vasquez's face. "The vascular work held," Vasquez explained. "The chest damage was severe, but we controlled it. He lost a great deal of blood." She paused. "But he is out, and his pressure is steady. Very steady. Not the kind we have to manage every 30 seconds. The kind of steady that meant his body was finally fighting back." Flora let out a small breath. It was almost unnoticeable. But Vasquez, at 54 years old and a master at reading people, saw it. "You did excellent work on him," Vasquez said. "Your training was superb." Flora looked at her for a second. "Thank you, Renata." Vasquez watched her with the direct, unsentimental eye of a surgeon. She had seen amazing feats in impossible times and called them what they were. "Do you want to see him?" she asked. "Not now," Flora replied. "Let him get some rest." Vasquez gave a single nod. "He is going to ask for you when he wakes. You should know, whatever your connection is. He said your name before surgery. Not Angel. Flora." She looked at her directly. Just Flora. Flora pressed her lips together and stayed quiet. Vasquez placed a firm, supportive hand on her shoulder and then walked off. For exactly 30 seconds, Flora stood alone in the hall. Then she composed herself, pulled down her sleeve, and went to find Vance. At 4:23 in the morning, he was in the family waiting room. He was finally alone for the first time in 4 hours. He was sitting down with his elbows on his knees, hands folded in front of him. In that moment, he looked less like an officer and more like a weary traveler at his journey's end. Flora sat in the chair across from him uninvited. He glanced up. "He is out," she said. "Vasquez reports he is stable." Vance shut his eyes for just 2 seconds. When he opened them, the colonel was mostly back in control. "Good," he said, his voice more hoarse than it was at 2 in the morning. "That is good. Harmon is in federal custody," she added, "as of 40 minutes ago. The 2 from the service hall are being processed." He looked down at his hands. "There is going to be an investigation, a real one. How far up does it go? We do not know yet." He met her eyes. "Far enough that your name appeared in files it should not have. Far enough that the incident 3 years ago is starting to look very different." Flora leaned back. The waiting area was deserted except for them. Outside, the first hint of gray morning light was showing above the trees. It was that pale glow before the sun rises, when the day has not yet decided what it will be. "You are going to ask me to come back," she stated. "I am going to tell you the investigation will require your testimony," Vance said with care, "and that the mission Barnes's team was on is still incomplete. That is not a real answer." "No," he agreed, "it is not." He looked right at her. "I want you to return. I feel your skills are underused here." Flora countered. "I save people's lives in this place every night. You save lives no matter where you are. That is not the issue." "Then what is the issue?" He paused. "It is whether this life is what you truly want or just the one you took because you felt the other was no longer an option." Flora held his gaze for a long time. Down the hallway, she could hear Deborah's calm, steady voice bringing order to the floor. The hospital's normal rhythm was returning after the chaotic night. She heard monitors, footsteps, and the distant arrival of the elevator. "I need to think about it," she said. Vance nodded. "I know, and I need you to allow me proper time to do that. No phone call in a week. No one ambushing me in my parking lot. Understood." She rose to her feet, and he stood as well. It was the reflex of a man from a generation that stood for serious conversations. They faced each other, and Flora felt the complicated bond she had with John Vance. He trained her, but also held back secrets, and now had upended her new life. He had changed it all in a single night. None of it was simple, but she had stopped hoping for simple a long time ago. "Get some rest, Colonel," she said. "You also," he replied. She almost smiled. "I am on duty until 7. She turned and left. At 4:31 in the morning. Deborah was at the nurse's station with a coffee, looking like someone who had just managed a crisis and was now facing the paperwork. She glanced up as Flora walked over. "Barnes is out of the woods." It was a statement. "Vasquez must have told you. Vasquez tells me everything. We have worked side by side for 6 years. Deborah put down her mug. "How are you doing?" Flora sat across from her. She felt a deep weariness for the first time since midnight. Not a physical exhaustion, but the kind that comes from being seen after 3 years of being invisible. "I am not sure yet," she said with honesty. Deborah accepted her answer without judgment. She was a person who knew that truth was often more important than comfort, and wisely offered neither when they were not needed. Instead, she simply slid her coffee mug over to Flora. Flora looked down at it. Then she lifted it and took a drink. "The staff will have questions," Deborah said. "I hear Cassie is already guessing you are a secret agent." "Cassie is not entirely incorrect," Flora replied. "I told her you were a nurse. That is also not entirely incorrect." Deborah watched her for a moment. "Which one will you be from this point on?" Flora set the mug down. She surveyed the station around her, the familiar layout of monitors, clipboards, and medicine logs. She saw the board with all the patient names. It was the ordinary, crucial machinery of a place where frightened and vulnerable people came for help from someone who knew what to do. "I am going to be who I am," Flora said. "Whatever that might mean." Deborah nodded. "A good answer." "You think so?" "It is an honest one for you, for now. That is what counts." At 4:44 in the morning, Paul Hennessy found her restocking Supply Bay 3. He had found her doing that same task many times before, but this time was completely unlike any other. He stood in the doorway. She was aware he was there, but did not stop her work. "Vasquez says he is going to recover," Paul said. "I know." She also mentioned what you did in the trauma room, the field medicine, adjusting the defibrillator, the way you handled his injuries. He paused, then began again. "She said that in 22 years as a surgeon, she has never seen anything like that. Vasquez is very generous," Flora said. "Flora." His voice sounded different now. It was not the careful, professional tone he had used all night. He was not keeping his emotions separate anymore. This was something else. "Please, talk to me. Not as a doctor, not as your colleague." He stopped. "Just as someone who has tried to get to know you for a year and now realizes he had no clue who you were." Flora stopped what she was doing. She turned and faced him. Paul Hennessy was a good man. She had always been sure of that, which was why she kept him at a specific distance, because good men deserved the truth. And for 3 years, honesty was something she could not afford. "I was never going to tell you any of this," she said. "Not because I did not want to, but because I had to protect something." "Were you protecting yourself?" "Yes. And the people around me?" He took this in. "The crash 3 years ago. Were you there?" "Yes." "You survived." "I caused it," she admitted, "to disappear, to protect my team from a security breach I could not prove." He was quiet for a moment. "That is the most isolating thing I have ever heard." Flora looked at him. She did not expect him to say that. She had braced herself for questions and a logical analysis from someone trying to rearrange his understanding of her. "That isn't what it was," she said softly. Paul looked at her, his expression open and tired, like a man who had given up hiding how he felt. So, what is the plan now? Vance is asking you to return. He asks for a lot of things. What do you want? She paused before answering. Not because she was unsure, but because she was carefully checking her answer for the truth before letting it out. I want to complete my shift, she said. Then, I want to get some sleep. After that, I will figure out everything else. He watched her for a second. Can I ask you something? You can try. The picture in your locker, he said. The one you believe no one else has seen. Flora froze completely. Paul spoke with care. I saw it by mistake about 2 years ago. You had left your locker ajar when Sims called you away in a rush. I was not trying to pry, he hesitated. There were people in it, wearing uniforms. You appeared different. Younger, maybe, but also more like your true self than I have ever seen you here. He looked right at her. Were those your people? Flora glanced at the ground for a moment. Then she looked back up. Yes, she confirmed. Were they good people? The majority of them were, she replied. Yes. Paul gave a slow nod. I need you to know, he said, that no matter what you choose, whatever happens next, you were good people here as well. He said it plainly, without any flattery, and without the romantic tone she had always sensed and avoided. It was just a clean and direct fact. This place was improved by you, and the patients were better for it. We were all better. He took a breath. I just want you to understand that someone saw you, even when you were trying so hard to remain unseen. Flora stared at him for a long while. She thought of her parking space at the very back of the lot, the 6 words she spoke at the beginning of each shift, the sleeves that were always rolled down, the photograph hidden behind the metal door of Locker 47. She remembered Michael Barnes saying her name before surgery, not a call sign, just Flora. She thought of Deborah Sims, who had moved patients from the walls before she even knew the reason. She did it because something in Flora's expression told her to, and who had confronted a colonel and a deputy director, saying, shame on both of you, and who pushed a coffee mug toward her across the counter at 4:30 in the morning without needing to say a word. She thought of Cassie, who was 26 and terrified, but had still stayed and followed orders perfectly, and Ortega, who was always calm and steady, and Marcus Webb, who had turned pale and swallowed hard, but went into that trauma room anyway. She thought of the life she had built from silence and control, from the daily decision to be smaller than she truly was, and she wondered if smaller meant the same as safe, and if safe was the same as good, and if good was a choice you made one time, or something you had to choose again every single night. She picked up the supply list she had put down. Go home and rest, Paul, she told him. He smiled. It was his real smile, not the charming one he used in the hallways. It was the smaller, more sincere one she had only seen a few times. You are truly one of a kind, you know. I have heard that before, she said. He left. At 5:02 in the morning, Barnes woke up. It was earlier than Vasquez had anticipated, because Michael Barnes often did things sooner than expected, and had his entire adult life. He did not wake up slowly. He surfaced from sleep hard and fast, like combat veterans often do. His hand was already reaching for a weapon that was not there. His eyes scanned the room before his mind had fully caught up. The room came into focus. A white ceiling, medical machines, a window turning gray with the dawn. A nurse he did not know was checking an intravenous line. He looked at the nurse. Montgomery, he said. His voice was rough and raspy, barely a sound at all. The nurse glanced up. Sir, please remain calm. You are in the recovery room. You are safe. Flora Montgomery, he insisted. Where is she? Sir, I have to speak with her. He was already attempting to sit up and was learning just how much his body objected to that idea. Sir, please go get her, he ordered. It was not a request. The nurse, to her credit, left immediately. At 5:09 in the morning, Flora entered the recovery room. Barnes looked at her just as he had once before, in a burning building in a country she was not meant to be in when she had emerged from the smoke. And he had said, with the dark humor of a man who joked because the alternative was too much to bear, oh, good. I was starting to worry you were not going to make it. He seemed smaller in the hospital bed, the way powerful people often do when their bodies force them to face reality. But his eyes were the same, sharp and weary, holding 15 years of shared history. You look awful, she said. She took the chair next to his bed. I was shot, he replied. What is your excuse? A long night. He watched her for a long moment. You saved me again, he said. That makes 2 times. I can count, Michael. You are also still here, he noted. In this hospital, in these scrubs, I am an employee here. Right. He studied her face with the focused gaze of someone who knew her long enough and well enough to see what lay beneath the surface. You look different. You already said that, but the other way around. No, I mean you look different now than when I first came in. He paused. You look like someone who just remembered who they are. Flora looked down at her hands. The angel wing tattoo on her wrist was just visible past her sleeve. She did not bother to cover it. Barnes, she began. Montgomery, how did they locate you? His jaw clenched. Dolan. I am certain it was Dolan. I mean, how exactly? The mission briefing, he said. The night before the operation, the only people there should have been cleared multiple times. He stared at the ceiling. Kandahar was him too, wasn't it? Yes. He was silent for a second. Chen, he said. Chen was the one who did not make it out of Kandahar. His name was a weight she carried like the tattoo, always present even when unseen. Yes, she confirmed. He shut his eyes for a moment, then opened them. I spent a long time trying to find out what happened to you after the crash. I know. You could have contacted me. I could not contact anyone, she said. If I told one person I trusted, then it became a question of who they might tell, and then who that person might. She trailed off. I did not understand the full danger yet. I could not take that chance. Did you know it was Dolan? I suspected someone on the inside. I just did not know who. She met his eyes. I am sorry, I could not tell you. He held her gaze for a long time. You do not have to apologize for staying alive, he said, his voice softer now. You never owe anyone that. She looked at him and felt the immense weight of his words. The unique kindness of it landed in a place she had not realized was still wounded. Vance wants me to return to duty, she said. I know. He kept his eyes on her face. What do you want? It was the second time someone had asked her that in the last hour. She thought of her simple, partial answer to Paul. She looked at Barnes, the only person there who knew both sides of her, the complete story of who she was before she became the woman in faded scrubs. I want to stop running, she said. I am just not sure which way I am supposed to be facing. Barnes was silent for a moment. Then he said, You know what I realized about you a long time ago? What? You always see your choices as one or the other. Stay or go, past or future, combat medic or hospital nurse. It is always one thing or the other. He moved slightly, grimacing from the pain it caused. But you have been both of those people at the same time every single night you have worked in this place. You just refuse to see it clearly. Flora was quiet. You did not disappear here, he continued. You became something. Something real. Something that was genuinely you. He looked at her with a steady gaze. The call sign was never who you were. It was just your job. Same as the scrubs, same as the tattoo, same as everything. She glanced down at the angel wing on her wrist. She remembered the night she got it, all alone in a strange city, in a tattoo shop that smelled of cleaning solution and stale coffee. She had told herself it was a memorial, a final goodbye to Angel 6 before she became a different person. She realized now, sitting in that chair at 5 in the morning, that she had been wrong. It was not a goodbye. It was a connection, a proof that the person before the crash and the person after were one and the same. Nothing she had ever done or been had erased any other part of her. She had not left herself behind in the smoke. She had carried herself all the way through it. At 8 in the morning, Vance was in the hospital hallway with his coat on, about to leave, when Flora approached him. He saw something in her expression that made him stop and wait. I will provide my testimony, she stated. Everything I know about Dolan, about the security breach, about Kandahar, all of it. She met his gaze directly. But it needs to be official that I am a witness in this case, not a recovered agent. I am a civilian nurse who was at the scene of an incident. That is how it will be written in the file. Vance observed her and then asked, "And after the investigation?" "After the investigation," she said, "I will consider what happens after the investigation." That is not a yes. "No," she acknowledged. But it is not a no, either. He thought about this for a long moment. Then he offered his hand. She looked at it, and then she shook it. It was a firm, honest handshake between two people who knew that some things did not need any more words. He told her there was one last thing. Flora waited. He explained that her colleagues, the nurses, and the doctor would need an official briefing. They had to know what they could and could not say about tonight. He paused, wanting her to know it was coming, and promising to handle it with care. Flora thought of Deborah, who moved patients from the walls on pure instinct and stood up to generals, never asking for credit. She remembered Paul in the doorway of Bay 3 at 4:40 in the morning, telling her that her work had been seen. She recalled Ortega, Cassie, and Marcus Webb, who all survived this night and made it through. "They are good people," she stated. "They will manage." "I know," Vance replied. "They have an excellent nurse." He started for the exit. At the door, he turned for one final look at her. It was a quick glance, as if he were memorizing a moment. Then he stepped through the doors and disappeared. She returned to her duties. That was the simplest way to describe what came next. She went back to her job. The shift ended at 7, and there were patients to care for. There was a floor to run and a status board to update. It was the normal, crucial, unending work of a place where damaged people came to be made a little more whole. Deborah found her at the station and gave her new charts without a word. Deborah knew the best thing for someone who had survived a battle was to have useful work for their hands. Ortega was restocking supplies. Cassie was handling a new patient, a 70-year-old man with a possible hip fracture, who was being brave in that particular way of his generation, where complaining felt like a personal defeat. Flora went to him first. She introduced herself, her voice in its usual low and steady tone. She asked for his name. She listened to his replies and truly saw him as she did, giving her full, honest attention. She understood that the patient before her was the only thing that mattered in that moment. His name was Gerald. He was 72. He had fallen while getting up to let his dog outside. "Is the dog all right?" Flora asked. The question seemed to surprise him a little. "Yes," he said. It scared him, though. "He waits by the door for me when I am gone." She said, "He is a good dog. Let us get you fixed up so you can go home to him." Gerald studied her for a second. "You are a good nurse," he said, with the simple honesty of a man who never wasted words. Flora met his gaze. "Thank you, Gerald," she replied, and she truly meant it. At 6:58 in the morning, 1 minute before the day shift came in, Flora Montgomery stood at the nurse's station, finishing her final chart. The emergency room had returned to its normal state. It was the unique, working quiet of a department that had endured a crisis and was now moving forward. That was the job, and the job never stopped. She glanced at the board. 12 patient names were there, with 3 set to be discharged before morning. Barnstable was in recovery, Dolan was in federal custody, somewhere she did not need to know. Vance was already on a plane. She looked at her scrub sleeve and slowly, deliberately, pushed it up to her elbow. It was an action of choice, not of concealment. The angel wing tattoo was unchanged. It had dark lines, sharp feathers, and the little flaws of something made by human hands. She had not really seen it in a long time, the way you stop noticing things you see every day, but now she looked at it directly, the way Barnes had taught her to face things head on. It was not a farewell. It was never a farewell. It was a link between two parts of herself, both of them real, part of one unbroken person who had walked through chaos, 3 years of hiding, and emerged from this night still there. Deborah came up beside her. She saw the tattoo, but said nothing. "It was a good shift," Deborah said. Flora looked at her. "It was a difficult shift." "Those are still shifts," Deborah replied, "and they can still be good." Flora pulled her sleeve down, but after a moment, she pushed it right back up again. The day shift came in, and Flora Montgomery, night nurse, combat medic, Angel 6, and everything she was, clocked out at 7:03 in the morning. She walked to her car and sat. In the pale morning light, she just breathed. She did not weep. Crying did not come easily to her, and tonight had not altered that fact. She pulled the photograph from her pocket. She had taken it from locker 47 before she left. It no longer needed to be hidden. 7 people in uniform squinted into the sun. Somewhere bright, hot, and very far from Oregon. Michael Barnes was second from the left, smiling like the troublemaker he always was. She was third from the right, staring right at the camera. She had the look of someone who did not know what was ahead. In that moment, she was completely and simply herself. She studied it for a very long time. Then she placed it on the dashboard against the windshield where she could see it and started her drive home. For 3 years, Flora Montgomery had built a life on the idea that being invisible was the safest way to be. She knew now how wrong she had been. It was not because the night had shattered her or taken something she could never recover. It was because the night had proven the complete opposite. It had proven that every part of her past was still there, still worked, and was still who she had always been. No amount of quiet living, careful distance, or rolled down sleeves could change the core of who she was. She was Flora Montgomery. She was Angel 6. She was the woman who had made a wreck vanish and rebuilt her life from scratch in a suburban Oregon hospital, saving people the only way she knew how. She did it completely, without holding back, and with hands that were always steady. She was all of those people at the same time. She had been all along, and she was done hiding.